We're going to start really quick by going back to 1921 for a film that I said was lost, but it turns out that I was wrong, and it's available now and came out on October 6th of 1921 in Germany, and it's Der Müde Tod, otherwise known as Destiny. It has a couple in a carriage that also has a woman just traveling with a duck that they wrap a blanket around, and I'm like, if I'm traveling and someone has a duck, I'm gonna want to see that thing the whole time. Along the way, they stop for a dark-clad stranger and give him a ride. They go into town, and he soon becomes the big gossip topic, and he buys a big garden next to a cemetery and builds this massive wall around it with no doors to get in. One day, the stranger shows up at a bar where that young couple are, and when the woman goes home real quick, she returns to find her lover gone, and they say that he left with the stranger. She goes looking for him, winding up at that wall, only to see a group of spirits go straight through it and her. Unfortunately, her lover is among them, and as she tries to beg him not to leave, he goes through. She's despondent, so she manages to cross over and confront the stranger, who is actually Death, and tries to plead for the life of her love. She claims that love is stronger than death, so he offers her a challenge and shows her 3 candles that are flickering, which means that they're close to death. He then says that if she's able to save any of the lives with love, that he'll return her fella. It then tells 3 stories, the first being set at Ramadan and telling of a man accused of being an infidel who narrowly escapes with his life, but that guy's in love with the caliph's sister and tries to return to her in secret while being hunted down. The second story takes place in Venice during a carnival season, and a noblewoman has a lover, but also a fiancé who's a member of the upper crust, and she's obligated to marry him even though she hates him. Girolamo knows about Gianfresco, though, and plans to have him killed, and although she plans to save him, Girolamo has other ideas. The third story is set in China and has a magician get a letter from the emperor who wants to have him perform at his party, but if he doesn't impress him, he'll get beheaded. Trouble arises when the imp wants Ahi's assistant for himself, though her lover disapproves and is taken away for it, and it's now up to Tiao to escape and rescue her guy. And this one is from visionary director Fritz Lang, the man who will later see do Metropolis and M. And this was the big film for him that he was known for before those others gained more notoriety. When released, it wasn't a big success since it was considered by the German audiences to not be German enough, but it grew in acclaim over time and was a huge inspiration to a number of filmmakers, including Alfred Hitchcock. For a bit, the intertitles were said to be lost, but they were later recovered and the film was fully restored, and is now available in a high-quality format. And this is gorgeous. It's a 4 from me. It's beautifully told, and a good variety of stories, and it's just so visually stunning. Its cultural significance is a 2.5 though, and I may get some flack for that considering how much of a big influence it's had on filmmakers, but not so much the audience, and it just doesn't have that recognition that other Lang works have. Should you watch it? Yes, it's your density. Now that we've covered that, let's jump into 1925, and our first horror entry here is from March 16th, and it's The Monster. It begins with a car being driven off the road and a pretty impressive crash scene, and some men crawl out to check out the car, and we're told that his name is Bowman, and he's now missing. At the scene of the crash, a clue is found, and this trio, which includes an amateur detective named Johnny, are trying to crack the case. Johnny thinks that there's something about an old sanitarium, but everyone keeps insisting that it's been closed for years and isn't a factor. But Johnny keeps it up, because after all, he has a diploma for a school of detective, which sounds very official. While investigating, Johnny ends up in a tunnel while Amos and his lady friend Betty are run off the road as well, and everyone winds up at the old sanitarium. There, they meet the creepy-looking Dr. Ziska, and he claims to be in charge there, and he's played by the man of 1,000 faces, Lon Chaney. He claims to be running the show there now and introduces them to his trio of patients who remain there, but everything is then sealed off, shutting our crew inside. Some shenanigans ensue as Johnny gets drunk and they try to find a way out of the place, eventually stumbling into Ziska's dark secret. So this one was by Roland West, who we actually already encountered when I did the 30s project, as he directed a film called The Bat Whispers. But unlike a lot of the guys from this era, he wasn't doing like 10 movies a year. He only directed 14 films, and this was his ninth, so closer to the ending of his career. It was based on a play that had the same name, and it's considered to be the prototype of the old dark house style of films that would become popular in the coming decades. It was also regarded as one of the very first horror comedies, what with Johnny's goofy bumbling. It was considered a disappointment when it was released, as fans were expecting more Chaney and more horror, although even though it didn't make as much money as expected, it was still the #1 movie for the week it was released, and some consider it to be the first horror film to top the box office. And this is amusing, I'll give it a 3. Chaney mugs it up for as much as he's in it, but Johnny Arthur as Johnny makes this worth watching since he's got some good comic bits going on. Its significance is a 2.5 since it's really not all that well known, but it's got Chaney and had a big influence on the spooky house genre in the coming years. Should you watch it? Sure, this monster's worth a look. Let's now go ahead a bit further into the year, and even though this one had a premiere on February 2nd, it was officially released on June 22nd, and it's The Lost World. It's got this bumbling reporter named Malone, and he's looking to be sent on a big story, but instead they send him to cover a lecture of an explorer named Challenger. Seems the guy is claiming that he's seen actual dinosaurs in uncharted areas of the Amazon, but he's mocked by his peers and is banned at the press from his appearances. He takes it all in stride, though, and dares any of those who are laughing at him to come up with him on his next expedition, and he'll show them the dinos. Malone jumps at the chance and fesses up to being a reporter, which causes the prof to flip out and leave, but he follows him to his home to beg for a chance to go, which hilariously causes him to fight him and roll down the stairs. He eventually relents, and they all head out on their journey, along with a monkey, who clearly does not want to be on camera. And a sloth that seems pretty okay with it, as most sloths are. Those suckers are camera whores. At first, they only see known animals, but then they encounter a sort of ape man, and then a pterodactyl, and look at that glorious stop motion. And they call it a pterodactyl, and I'm not much of a dinosaur expert, but it appears as if this is an error, and this is in fact a pterodon, as they're much bigger and have that crested head. There's also a Brontosaurus and various other dinos just strolling about like an Allosaurus and Triceratops, and our heroes soon have to try to find a way out and bring back proof that the Lost World ain't so lost. And this early special effects extravaganza was by Harry A. Hoyt, and would essentially be the only thing that he directed of note, but he continued writing all the way throughout the 40s. It was adapted from Arthur Conan Doyle's book of the same name from 1912, and the writer would make an appearance before the film to introduce it, although that sequence is missing from a number of versions that are out there today. It was the first full-length film to have stop-motion animation in it, and was by the legendary Willis O'Brien, who would later go on to do King Kong, which clearly took some inspiration from this story here. And it should be noted that before the film was shot, some test footage was screened for a crowd of magicians, and an ensuing newspaper article covering the event was convinced that the shots were real. It had a huge cost for the time of $700,000, and it was a big hit, earning $1.5 million. It was such a success that they were planning a remake as soon as sound film became a thing, but it didn't happen for quite a while afterwards. In fact, it took until 1960 for the film to be redone, but there's been about 5 more since then, although the Jurassic Park sequel is not connected. It simply utilizes the name as an homage. And what a fun time. I'm going with a 3.5. Like, sure, the plot is pretty damn repetitive in the entire middle of the film, but it's giving you so many cool dinos to look at. Its significance is a 4, since even if people haven't seen the whole film, so many have at least seen parts of it and know the name and those dinosaur shots. Plus, it introduced stop motion and dinosaur action to the world. Should you watch it? Yep, this should not remain lost. We now go to July 16th, and we're now about halfway through the year and have a little number called Wolf Blood. We're at this little logging company up in Canada. And did you know that logging is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world with the highest number of deaths? It has one of the highest rates of injury as well. If you're curious, delivery drivers like pizza delivery and such is number 7. Also, if you're curious, police officers are number 22. The company has a new boss in Dick Bannister, and there's a rivalry with another nearby company. There's a number of injuries at the place, much to the shock of Edith Ford, who's having a grand time dancing with her fiancé, but then they all end up heading out to inspect the place. But while they're there, Dick falls for Edith and is heartbroken to find out that she's engaged. When reports of their rivals coming into their territory increase, Dick goes to confront them, which leads to a tussle and a D being left for dead. He's injured so badly that he needs an immediate transfusion, but with no people around, the doc makes a pretty rash decision and shoots him up with wolf's blood, because why not, right? Pretty soon, though, it appears as if that blood is giving him some side effects, and when the rival loggers start getting bumped off by wolves, everyone starts to think that he's not just Dick anymore. Now, he's Werewolf Dick. The director here was George Chesborough, and was his only film that he directed, but he was a pretty prolific actor in a number of westerns up until the 50s. In fact, he has 425 acting credits to his name, although it appears as if a number of them went uncredited in the movies themselves. This one was also known as Wolf Blood, A Tale of the Forest, and some say that it's the first werewolf movie ever made, but that honor actually goes to 1913's The Werewolf, but since that one is lost, this is currently the oldest existing one. It should be noted that there's not so much of a transformation of a man into a wolf-like creature here, and the blood only gives him a wolf-like nature and makes him angrier and violent, so calling it a werewolf movie is even a little generous. And I'm giving this one a 2. Not much happens here. It takes way too long to get to the wolf blood stuff and far too much time with the less interesting romance subplot. Its significance is a 2, and it's tricky because this has notoriety for being the oldest werewolf film you can watch, but it's not the legend as we know it, and it's still a very obscure flick. Should you watch it, you can probably live without this blood in you. This next one takes us overseas for an entry that doesn't have a set release date, but it came out in Russia at some point in 1925 and played in the US in 1928, and it's The Bear's Wedding, otherwise called Marriage of the Bear. I couldn't quite find this one anywhere with English intertitles, so I had to settle for a version in Russian, and I was able to use a translator app to figure out the premise. But it opens with everyone out in the snow, with some animal cruelty towards a dog that I'll just skip over here, but it's a hunting party that encounters a bear. They shoot it dead, but another one manages to fight back and attack the Countess, who's pregnant. It gives her a good scare and tries to drag her off, but they're able to rescue her. She lives but is traumatized and gives birth shortly afterwards and is still horribly affected by that bear. As time goes on, she's unable to escape that moment and is constantly haunted by that unbearable moment until she's barely even alive. And it turns out that her son develops the odd quirk of dressing up in some sort of bear suit and heading out to attack young women. Or maybe it's not a suit at all, and he's transforming into some sort of bear creature. Well, this is brought to us by Konstantin Eggert and Vladimir Gardan and was also based on a play. That was called The Marriage of the Bear and was based on a novel called Lokis, which means bear. Like Wolf's Blood, it can be seen as an early take on a lycanthrope legend, although this time with a bear as opposed to a wolf. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of prints in existence, and the quality is rather poor, creating a dark and murky image that's quite hard to see at times. There was a point in which it was claimed to have been lost, although there were screenings of the film on Russian TV, so it's clearly been in circulation for quite a while. It's hard to say how successful it was, but the story's been adapted 2 more times, once in 1971 and the other in 1975. And I'm giving this another 2, although I think I might have a higher opinion of it if I were able to check out a better copy. It's just so hard to figure out what's going on, and not having titles I could read didn't help. But it's also a bit tedious. Its HCS is a 1.5 since it's super obscure and unspoken of, and maybe one of the earliest man transforming into an animal movies out there. Should you watch it? You could bear skipping it. Let's stay overseas and head over to Finland for a movie that came out on October 19th there, even though it's not a Finnish film, and one that got released in the US in 1931, and it's called Maciste in Hell. It begins with depictions of hell and introduces Pluto and Maciste and Barbaricia, and Pluto rules down there. He's got a real look. Everyone does, really, as these makeups are fun and over the top, and Pluto orders Barbs to try to take out Maciste, since he's a force of good. Meanwhile, the crew head out of hell and meet up with Charon and take on human form and encounter Machi. He's known for his strength and his awesome big muscles, and they try to tempt him with riches, but nothing they try works. Eventually, they steal his neighbor's baby in order to trick him, and when he comes to the child's aid, they whisk him away to hell. While there, they put him through a series of punishments, but he fights back, just like swinging demons over his head, which is pretty awesome. There's also this decree that says that a human can only remain in hell for 3 days unless he's kissed by a woman. And well, Luciferina may have something to say about that. And can we talk for a minute about how upset that I am that I didn't name my daughter Luciferina? And even though I said that this one debuted in Finland, it was actually an Italian film and was by Guido Brignone, a man who did a large number of films starting in 1916 and stretching all the way to 1959. And he'd probably have kept going, but he died in 59. And Maciste is not just a character for this film. He appeared in several other Italian silent films, including one from 1914 and then in 26 more movies. And he was always played by Arthur Bartolomeo Pagano. It's weird because there was no consistency to the character. His films were set in various time frames and settings, and the only constant was that he was this big, strong dude who fought for good. He had a resurgence in the 50s, but since the character wasn't well known outside of Italy, in other markets they were dubbed over to become Hercules films. This particular entry even got a remake in 1962. And I enjoy this for the most part, so I'll go with a 3. It starts strong, but then gets dull for a bit, but ends up strong again. Its significance is just a 1, since it's almost entirely unknown and not one that's spoken of at all. Should you watch it? Maybe? I mean, it's pretty fun, and I love the big muscle suit from Maciste, so it's worth a peek. Here we go now with what is likely the highest profile project in this episode, because even though it had some premiere screenings earlier in the year, on November 15th, there was the wide release of The Phantom of the Opera. It's set at the swanky-danky Paris Opera House, and there's rumors there about a phantom that seems to be haunting the place, although some simply laugh it off. In the middle of a practice, some of the dancers spot him and claim he was noseless, or maybe had a giant nose, and I love that they're so freaked out by it all that they can't help but pirouette. Their prima donna is a woman named Carlotta, and she gets a letter from a phantom saying that she must allow her understudy Christine to sing in her place, but she refuses. It seems the mysterious one has taken a liking to Christine and is trying to further her career, and when Carlotta continues to go on, the phantom drops a whole-ass chandelier on the crowd. Afterwards, Christine follows a hidden door behind her mirror and comes face to face with the Phantom, wearing a mask that isn't quite what you think of when you picture this guy, and he leads her down into the sewers to keep her locked up in his lair. Of course, her disappearance is noted and they start looking for her, and her curiosity about what's under that mask gets the better of her, leading to one of the greatest reveals in cinema history. And this is, of course, an adaptation of the 1909 tale from Gaston Leroux, The Phantom of the Opera, and this was the second attempt at bringing it to life, and the first being in 1916, which is now lost. It was from Universal, and the head of the company, Carl Lommel, met Leroux in 1922, and he gave him a copy of the book, which he read in one night, and immediately brought the rights to do a film version. The director was Rupert Julian, who had been in film since 1914, and we encountered him sort of in the 1930s project, since his final film was The Cat Creeps, a horror flick from 1930 that is now lost. Of course, Lon Chaney was hired as the Phantom as he was the leading horror star at that time, and that was the start of some problems since he didn't get along with Julian on set, and the two fought to the point of not speaking to each other, and they required a middleman to deliver direction to the star, which Chaney then promptly ignored. They also changed the ending during filming as the studio thought that the original novel ending was too low-key and wanted something more dramatic, but when they wrapped up filming, more problems arose. An early test screening was super negative, complaining about the melodrama and wanted more humor and hated the new ending. Then they went back into production, did a number of reshoots without Julian involved, adding some comic relief. And when that version had a test screening, well, that didn't go well either, and the film was booed loudly. They went back in and edited it down, cutting out a number of the new scenes and restoring a good deal of things that were removed, but kept the new ending. With all of this, the critical reaction was pretty mixed, but it did well at the box office, and audiences were shocked and fainted at the reveal of the Phantom's face. There would be multiple versions of the film, including some sound versions and color restoration, and the Phantom would then live on in a large number of remakes and readaptations, and even Universal took a second shot of it in the 1940s. The character really broke out with the musical version, which reached massive status and catapulted the story into the mainstream even more. And I like it, but I also agree that this is fairly uneven version of the tale, so I'm going to go with a 3.5. The stuff that's great is wonderful, but it also doesn't seem to know what it wants to be at times, likely the result of the reshoots. Its significance is a 4.5 though, since it's probably the most well-known version of the story in terms of film, and everyone recognizes that shot of his face, but I also feel like the public's main knowledge for the character is not really from this particular version. Should you watch it? Yes, because if you don't, in sleep, he'll sing to you. We're heading into 1926 now, and the first film we're going to check out is from March 14th, although that was a premiere, and it went wider 1 week later on the 21st, and it's The Bat. We meet Gideon, a man who loves rare jewels, and he gets a letter from the Bat saying that he's going to steal his emeralds that night. Of course, Gideon prepares for him, but to no avail since he's found dead, and the Bat leaves a note saying that he's headed to the country. He dresses like a bat, and we see him busting into places with those crazy ears, which seems like a silly idea, really. Like, as a burglar, wouldn't you want to be less inconspicuous? There's this big estate out there being rented by Cornelia Van Gorder, a writer who's there for the summer, and they're on the lookout for the Bat, placing bear traps out for him with the wacky comic relief made. But then there's Richard, Cornelia's nephew. He's got some money troubles. He wants to lease out the mansion, but with her there, he can't. Pretty soon, there's letters showing up warning them to get out, so it seems like the Bat may be at hand. Or is he? When Richard gets shot, the police try to find a hidden room that's somewhere in the premises where it's said that a stash of money stolen from the bank may be hidden, and it appears as if the man himself is on hand, or at least someone dressed as him. And this one is from Roland West, the same man who did The Monster from earlier in this episode. It was based on a play called The Bat by Mary Roberts Reinhardt and was indeed the second time that it was adopted, because even in the 20s, everything is based on something or a remake of something. The filming was a little unusual for an American picture since there was a good deal of care placed into the sets and shot setups, seemingly taking inspiration from the German Expressionism films at the time. In order to achieve a spookier feel, they insisted on shooting only at night. When it was released, it was a huge hit, and although there aren't any official numbers, it was referred to as a box office knockout. For a while, it was thought to be lost, but thankfully, in the 80s, someone discovered a print, and it was once again available to view. One person who saw it before it was thought lost, though, was Bob Kane, who said that this was one of his inspirations for taking the credit for Batman away from Bill Finger. I'm sorry, I mean creating Batman. Also, this became known as West's biggest hit and was so enamored with the concept that in 1930 he remade it as The Bat Whispers, with sound, and that version was also successful, but not as much as this one was. And this is another 3.5. The story's a little humdrum, and there's too much walking around, but holy cow, is it pretty. The shots are just gorgeous and really take advantage of the shadows on hand. Its significance is a 2, since it did have some notoriety in its day and clearly had an influence on one Caped Crusader, but it's never really pushed much higher in recognition than that. Should you watch it? You should, chum. Put it on at the same bat time, the same bat channel. Just a few days later, on March 25th, we had another US premiere with an entry with a similar tone, and it's Midnight Faces. It begins with a house in the Florida Bayou, which used to belong to Peter Martin, but he's since died. His nephew, Lynn, inherits the place, and he heads there by canoe because all the best spooky houses are only accessible by boat, and he's accompanied by his lawyer and his service, Trohelius. No one has been there since Peter died, but there's a bunch of black candles all around and also a mysterious man lurking about. The staff arrives, including Lund, who is confined to a wheelchair, and right afterwards, a young woman appears, screaming for help. She claims that a man has chased her there, although they suspect that she may be only after Lynn's money, but things get dangerous when someone tries to poison them. And I don't know, maybe it's this guy all done up like the Shadow or whatever, but is Mary what she appears, or is she up to no good? Who keeps knocking on the walls? And can Trohelius just not be such a racist caricature? And this is a pretty early version of the old Dark House film, essentially the same genre as The Bat, and this was by Bennett Cohen, and was only his second directing gig. He'd go on to do a handful more films through 1934, but then stopped to focus on writing, and he has 192 writing credits as opposed to 16 directing ones. By this point, there have been several of this brand of film, sort of following the same formula, down to the inclusion of the bumbling manservant, but it didn't make all that much of an impact, and was mostly hailed as being a ripoff. And it's fine, I guess. I'll give it a 2. I think because I watched it back to back with The Bat, and that film did the same thing, but way better, this one just felt dull and flat with an easy-to-solve mystery. Its significance is just a 1, since no one's heard of this, and there's no names involved, and it certainly didn't impact the genre since it's just doing what other films had already done. Should you watch it? You don't need to face this one. We're now headed overseas for this one, which debuted in Tokyo on July 10th. It didn't get a run in the US until 1975, and it's called A Page of Madness. It has opening credits in which you can actually see someone turning the page, and then a dark and stormy night. As the downpour rages, we get flashes of imagery rapid fire, including a woman dancing inside of a cell, who seems to envision herself very differently. Next to her is another woman who mainly lays on the floor, and she's looked in on by an older man who turns out to be her husband, but she doesn't remember him. His family is very concerned about them as they blame him for his mother's condition, which seems to be getting increasingly worse. When the dancing patient gets everyone all riled up, a massive fight breaks out, causing chaos and getting the husband, who's the janitor there by the way, in trouble with the head doctor. Afterwards, he goes home and proceeds to have a series of visions about success and murder. Now, this looks pretty bizarre, and let me tell you, it is. It was directed by Hinosuke Kinugasa and was a group creation. It seems that there was this coalition of avant-garde artists known as the Shinkankuha, which translates to School of New Perceptions. Their whole thing was escaping naturalism, which was a movement that tried to create an illusion of reality through different elements, but this whole film was about going against that and making a more abstract impression. The screenplay is credited to Yasunari Kawabata, who won a Nobel Prize in Literature for his prose works in 1968, but it's also said that he was not the sole writer, and the script was a collaboration between him and several others on the crew. It doesn't feature intertitles, and the common practice at the time in Japan was to play the film while a narrator would flesh out the story with a live musical accompaniment. It was a massive hit over there, so much so that it crossed an important line. In this era, there were two types of movie houses in Japan: those that showed exclusively domestic films and those that did foreign films. This one was such a hit that they played it in both theaters, which was a relief to Kinugasa, who was bankrupt before the release. Not that long after its run, it was thought lost, though, and would remain that way for 45 years, until 1971, when the director was clearing out a storage cabin and stumbled upon a print in a rice barrel. Unfortunately, the surviving version is missing footage, and about a third of it is thought to be lost forever. And this one's wild. I'm going with a 3.5 on this. It's a bit hard to get into because of the lack of titles and narration, but it's just so damn pretty, and those strange images are a treat. Its significance is just a 1, though, since it's not well known over here at all and is not often spoke about. It likely has more significance in its home country, though. Should you watch it? Yes. I mean, if you dug Tetsuo the Iron Man, this feels like a visual forerunner in a way. This next one was back in the US, and we're fast forwarding a bit now to September 15th, and it's The Bells. It has Matthias here, and he's running an inn and hoping to be the burgomaster of their little town in Austria. And when I was younger, I thought they were saying burgermaster in movies, and holy crap, that I want to be the town burgermaster. Like, seems like a great job. But instead, a burgomaster is just a mayor, much less rad. Matthias has been letting people eat on credit, but then not collecting on that credit, and is quickly going broke, much to the delight of Franz, the guy he owes the money to. Seems Franz wants the inn for himself, and Matthias is none other than Lionel Barrymore, and this is the first time that we're seeing him on the project, although we've seen his brother John. Meanwhile, Matthias has a daughter named Annette, and she's so silly, just like hiding out in a bunch of hay, and France wants to marry her, so he says that he'll delete his debt if he arranges a marriage. One day, a mesmerist rolls into town, and this is a pretty big occasion since this is the first horror appearance for none other than Boris Karloff. At this point, he was in a bunch of films, but hadn't really claimed that crown of being known for spooky stuff yet. But things take a turn when a merchant enters the inn one night and has a money belt full of gold, so Matthias follows him out into the snow and kills him. But before he dies, the man shakes some bells at him, which then haunt Matthias at every turn. This one was directed by James Young, and this was one of his final films, although between 1912 and 1928, he's credited with 93 films. This one was based on a stage play called The Polish Jew, as the man with the belt is referred to as that in the film, and this was the 5th version of the story put on screen, although only the 2nd in the US. It would later be remade again in 1931 and in 1935. I guess, in a way, it's also the first Christmas-themed horror film, even though it's not like it's a major part of the story or anything, it's just when it's set. And even though it's mostly a kind of crime thriller, it's got haunting and ghosts and some early special effects. And I'll go with a 2.5 on this. It starts off great, but then just feels really repetitious after a while and takes too long to get to the point. Its significance is a 2, since it's not really spoken of all that much, but it's what I believe to be the first Christmas horror, and the first horror appearance by Karloff. Should you watch it? Depends. I mean, it's not bad, but it'll be okay to leave these bells unrung. Let's go over to Denmark now for a film that's debuted there on September 20th, although it's a German film, and did get released in the US a little later in the year on December 5th, and it's Faust. It's got the devil, and he's pretty ticked off about man being on Earth and whatnot, and he makes a deal with an archangel that he can corrupt the soul of a good man, and if he wins, he gets the whole planet. He shows up over this town, and I mean, like, look at this. This is awesome. And he lets loose a plague that ravages through everyone, which is less awesome. In the village, there's an old man named Faust, and even though he prays for help, there is none. So he makes a big decision and instead asks Mephisto for help instead. He shows up at his house and makes him a deal for his soul, which makes M pretty happy, and he uses that power to help people, but they shun him when the cross repels him. He then makes a further deal to become young again, and he's offered a woman and some early film nudity. He then takes Faust to meet the woman of his dreams while murdering her groom. Faust then becomes indebted to eternity while going about his newfound youth and trying to find love with young Gretchen. But is it too late for his soul? So, this one is an adaptation of an ancient tale, most prominently told in an 1808 version by Goethe. But this telling differs quite a bit from the source. It was by the great F.W. Murnau of Nosferatu fame, and it was the last German film that he would do before heading off to Hollywood to do features there. It was one of the most expensive and visually elaborate German films of the era and cost 2 million Reichsmark. It was more complicated than normal because they used multiple cameras instead of just one, which was standard at the time, and reportedly did more and longer takes than normal. Because he had delivered a big hit with a film called The Last Laugh, a dramatic film, the studio had essentially given him an unlimited budget and freedom to do what he wanted. The shoot was also longer than normal and went on for 2 months at a time when the general time frame for filming was a month or less. Plus, Murnau ended up making multiple versions and cuts of the film, each one differing quite a bit. Like, for instance, in one version, there's a bear and they use an actual bear, but in another version, it's a guy in a costume. There's said to be 5 different versions out there. But when it was released, it was a flop. Critics didn't like it and only ended up making back around half of its budget. Since then, though, it's taken on a reputation for being a gorgeous example of German expressionistic filmmaking and creating innovative special effects. And this one's pretty solid, so it gets a 3.5. Visually, it's a knockout and features some amazing set design. The story does feel a little sluggish for a good portion of it though, and the middle of it drags, but it's never not pretty. Its HCS is a 3 since it's a somewhat well-known take on the tale and a classic director, but it's another that's likely more important in its home country than it is here. Should you watch it? Yes, just don't expect anyone in a superhero costume. Our final film of this episode arrived on October 24th, and we're closing it back in the USA with The Magician. We're in a Latin quarter of Paris, and we meet a sculptor named Margaret, and she's working on this statue, but part of it collapses down and falls on top of her. Her spine is injured, and she suffers from a total paralysis and undergoes an experimental surgery to try and reverse it. A bunch of doctors observe, including, for some reason, Oliver Haddo, a hypnotist and magician. He's been searching for some sort of alchemy formula for creating human life, and one of the ingredients is the heart blood of a maiden, and he decides that the maiden of choice is Margaret. She recovers from her surgery and starts dating her doctor, which seems very, not a good decision, Doc. But they encounter Haddo. He's able to magically cure a snake bite. Later on, he hypnotizes Margaret, and here's where things go a little wild since he sees Pan manifest and a wild orgy in hell. And I say orgy, but it's mainly people running around, and oh, Conan is here with the Wheel of Pain. She's horrified by the experience and tries to have Arthur, who she's engaged now to, protect her. But Haddo clearly isn't letting her get away. Her and her maiden heart blood. And this one is from Rex Ingram. He wasn't extremely prolific, but he did do 30 movies between 1914 and 1932. And I know that sounds like a lot, but his contemporaries were churning out around 4 times that. It was another that was based on a previous work and was an adaptation of a novel from 1908 called The Magician by W. Somerset Maugham. It was apparently a difficult shoot, and Ingram cast his wife in the lead role, but she did quite well. And it was Paul Wegener, who played Haddo, who was very difficult on set. He would often yell at people, and the other actors were unimpressed with what he was doing. Also, Ingram is said to have lost interest in the product in mid-production and let other people direct segments that he found dull, which is why he's not really given a director's credit, and instead it says, supervised by Rex Ingram. It was pretty acclaimed on its release, although there's not much info about the box office, but it was then lost for decades. It was at one point considered one of the most sought after lost films out there, but after a while, multiple prints were found and it was available to view. Even then, for a bit, it was only shown on theatrical screenings and a few cable runs, and it took until 2011 for it to get any sort of a home release. And this is decent, so it gets a 3. It's weird because the ending of this movie feels like a whole different thing from the beginning, and I wish it had more of that going on earlier. Its significance is a 2 though, since it's not much spoken of and clearly didn't impact a whole lot since it was lost for so long, but it did influence Frankenstein some, so it has some relevance. Should you watch it? Sure, this magic show is pretty worth it.